Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So I've been reading this book, The Ancient City, and I think it's a really fascinating book. It kind of explains the traditions of ancient Rome and ancient Greece in a way that really helps us to understand how central religion was to pretty much everything that existed inside those cities, how it informed the law, how it informed politics, how it informed pretty much every institution that they had in that time. And so I wanted to talk to somebody who is very familiar with that book. And so I have with me Dr. Chad Pecknold. He is an assistant professor over at Catholic University of America of Theology. Chad, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure to be with you as always, Aaron.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really fascinating. You wrote a piece for the Post Liberal Order on this book, or at least incorporating a good amount of this book, which I thought was very interesting. And so I definitely want to bring your perspective in here as we kind of look at what Coulanges had to say about the ancient city and the way that religion really informed everything that they did. But before we get started with that, guys, let's go ahead and hear from today's sponsor. Are you a college student who feels isolated as Cthulhu swims ever leftward? The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is here to help. ISI offers programs and opportunities for conservative students across the country. ISI understands that conservatives and right-of-center students feel isolated on campus and that you're often fighting for your own reputation, dignity, and future. Through ISI, you can learn about what Russell Kirk called permanent things, the philosophical and political teachings that shaped and made Western civilization great. ISI also offers many opportunities to jumpstart your career. For example, Nate Hockman, who's been a guest on this show multiple times, got his start at National Review through ISI, and he's just one of many journalists that ISI has helped start their career. If you're a graduate student, ISI offers funding opportunities to sponsor the next generation of college professors. But most importantly, ISI offers college students a community of people that will help them grow. If you're a college student, ISI can help you start a student organization or a student newspaper or meet other like-minded students at various conferences and events. ISI is here to educate the next generation of great Americans. To learn more, check out isi.org. That's isi.org. You can click the link down in the description to learn more. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. So one of the things that I think is very helpful with this book is at the very beginning, Coulanges kind of encourages the reader to look at the ancient city as kind of an alien place, right? He says a lot of people look at ancient Rome and ancient Greece and they think of these as our ancestors. We're directly from their lineage. This is kind of how Western civilization evolved. And so we kind of push our own understanding of how these societies worked, our kind of modern understanding onto the rituals, the religious beliefs of these people. But he encourages us to really think of them as kind of an alien people because their ways are so different, so radically set apart from the way that many modern people think about religion and its role, to be kind of very different, a drastically different role.
Yeah, I think to make the ancient world strange, especially to Third Republic French liberals, like Robespierre and people who wanted to, in a sense, have this ideal of going back to the ancients. We'll go back to, Aristotle and Plato, and we'll just be pure naturalists. And I think one of the victories of this extraordinary study is not only that he got this was written in 1864, by the way, before there was such a thing as archaeology. And it's an extraordinary book because Fustel gets all of his information from studying classic texts, and so he kind of unearths the archaeology of Greek and Roman religion before there was such a thing as the archaeology of religion, and he gets it basically right. But one of his aims is, in a sense, to demonstrate for his countrymen that, in a sense, the ancient world that they want to go back to is not a religion-free zone. I mean, that's what the philosophers are kind of after, is some atheistic kind of natural order, and going back to the ancients is their idea. And he writes The Ancient City in part to demonstrate to them that that is quixotic. That's a fantasy. You're not going to go back to the ancients and find a religionless world. In fact, when you go back to the ancients, what you find is that, as he says, religion is the master science. Religion has the kind of architectonic power, explanatory power for the whole thing. It explains everything from marriage and family ties, kinship ties, how a family is held together, how families of families are held together, how philosophy is held together, how generations are held together, all by the bonds of religion. And so part of the project here is to demonstrate to 19th century philosophers that there's no doing without religion.
Which I think is a particularly useful project for many today who would like to abandon this crazy wokeness and get us all the way back to the classical liberalism of the 1990s, thinking that we can kind of just purge ourselves of this crazy new religion and get back to the good old days where everything was objective and scientific. And I think it's really important for people to understand that that's just not how humans operate. It never has been how humans operate. And the ancient city is most certainly a study on how I think people do actually operate. Though interestingly, he does say repeatedly that this is not a society that you can go back to in general anyway, that this is very much kind of its time, of its people, kind of its particular spirit. And so the caution about thinking that you're just going to return to a particular time is useful, even as it comes from somebody in the 1860s. But that said, let's kind of go ahead and get into some of the beginnings of his
Yeah.
explanation of the religion here, because I think most people, they think, the Romans, the Greeks, it's all about Zeus, it's all about Poseidon or something, and
You're right.
he really goes back and starts at a very ancient form of the religion in kind of Greece and Rome, talking about something that was much more akin to ancestor worship and was rooted very much in the idea of a sacred hearth, a sacred fire that the family would tend to kind of honor, their ancients and visit the tomb that was in the land where they're at. He even says things like property rights are developed specifically not because of any idea of individual ownership or a kind of autonomous use of something, but very specifically because you had to own the field your family was buried in because their spirits literally lived there.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean the hearth. I'm pointing at my hearth, and many people still today. I mean, some contemporary homes are built without fireplaces and hearths, but the idea even of in a single family home where you have a kind of classical eggs and dentals kind of structure around your fireplace, that is religious for the ancients. That there's a place in which the Vesta, the living flame of the family, is the root of all ancient civilization. And that sacred flame is the thing which binds together the family and then binds together the city. And as you say, uh, it binds you not only temporally, but also binds you over across time to your ancestors and to the future. And that hearth, as it were, has to be rooted somewhere. It has to be rooted in the place of your ancestors, and so you have to have land, you have to have property, and so the very idea that the sale of property is a kind of religious event. It's extremely complex in the ancient world to sell property, and we think, well, they didn't know about the free market, and you know, if only they had realtors.
Yeah.
But in fact, the reason why they don't do that is because even property is religious. Property has this religious significance. Inheritance, the same way, inheritance laws and primogeniture and the connection between a father and the eldest son, and how things are passed on from one generation to another is all bound by religion. And I mean, one of the interesting things is you might not see it in the ways that you expect to, right? You're looking for a place in which people are gathering, for singing hymns, passing the tithe plate around or something like that. And I think, like Emil Durkheim, uh, uh, Fustel shows, I think, that religion is more suffused into everything. It's just kind of baked into everything.
Yeah, it's the language by which kind of everyone communicates. It ties every different social interaction together. And I think most interestingly, at least for me, because I spent a lot of time on kind of politics and political theory and the origins of these things, he talks a lot about how all of the law in the ancient city is tied to religion. So as you kind of alluded to there earlier, you had it was considered, it wasn't just considered bad for someone to stay celibate, to not have children. It was literally an interruption of the worship. It was an interruption of the ability of father and son to pass along the worship and to continue to care for the ancients and to continue to provide the things that the ancestors would need once they had passed on. And so it was your moral duty to have that. Looks like we might have lost Chad there for a second, guys, but I'll just continue with explaining some of these aspects, and hopefully we'll have him back here soon. But the ancient world is a place where your continuing bloodline is not just there for your the carrying on property or something, but very specifically because they will have a duty to care for you in the afterlife. And so inheritance is not something you can just hand off through something like a will, because the son, if you were to hand this off to some random person, this property off to some random person, that person would not be part of your worship. And therefore them possessing your land would rob your ancestors and the future of your line of the ability to continue to participate in the worship. And so, as Dr. Pecknold was talking about, that's not just something that you lose as a possession, but it's actually a lineage and a future that you're denying to your family, as well as a denial of your ancestors of the worship that's due to them. I think you're back there,
Yeah,
Mr.
and I think
Dr. Pecknold.
Fustel's
Yeah.
very interested in. Yeah, I think Fustel's interested in this question of the family structure as the fundament of everything. That the family structure is inherently religious, and that it's the relationship between families which is also going to be religious. And so one of the problems that Fustel talks about is the way in which religion is essentially private. In a way, sometimes a liberal might think religion's a private thing. In a very, very special way in the ancient world, the domestic hearth, the Vesta of the domestic religion, was just for you and your family. You didn't pray to your ancestral gods for your neighbor, right? You wouldn't don't pray for your city. It's very private. And Fustel talks about the development of the civic religion as itself a problem. Is
Mhm.
you If everything is religious, and you have this development of a connection between families, and here he has in mind the primitive movement was the connection between aristocratic families, that what bound the aristocratic families together was also a new civic hearth, you could call it, a civic altar, and that civic altar was to a god that would protect that group of families as a tribe and then as a city. And so everything for Fustel kind of expands off of that. So you move from the domestic religion, which is private, to a civic religion, which is totally public. But its publicness is once again jealous. So you would pray to the god of that city for people in that city. You would never pray to that god for people in another city. And so you have this kind of way in which the religion starts to build up. And this is how he describes the movement of both Greek and Roman civilization as a movement of religious order that is kind of organically grows up as the binding instrument, as the relegare, the thing that knits things together, each according to their capacity.
Yeah, and I found that particularly interesting because I think it also plays into something that Bertrand de Juvenal talks about with his metaphysics of power, and how for the state to expand, it must
Mm.
collapse all competing spheres of social authority. But I don't want to get too far into that yet, because I think there's some other things I want to hit before we get there. But I think that the interesting thing
Mhm.
about this book is it lays out the development of these societies so well that I think it brings together a number of different threads of kind of political theory, and becomes a showcase for a number of kind of how these mechanisms work. But I do want to go ahead and touch, before we get to some of that stuff, about the power of the of kind of how laws have to follow the religious order. The laws for Fustel are basically things that come into being because they are formalizations of what already is religious doctrine, which already is kind of the tradition, and that the laws couldn't be anything else. He specifically says the idea that the Senate, or that the legislative body, would legislate something that was against the religion, or an opposition or a restriction on the religion, was crazy, because the families had so much authority, and the worship of the families had so much authority, that the government did not have the ability to kind of basically enshrine anything else. And so things like the ownership of the children, kind of a radical ownership of children, where you could sell your son or daughter, you could choose to kill them. All of these things are things that the society could not change, the government could not change, because the authority of the families themselves was ultimate. And so that meant that the laws, as they came into being, were purely kind of reflections of this religious order in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, not just the power of the families.
Oh, I lost him again. All right, guys. Well, exciting issues with connections. I guess I'll just continue to talk about this again until we get him back. Oh, he's back already.
Sorry.
All right, no problem.
Yeah,
We see you.
no, but the
Let's see.
the power of the fathers, the power of the father is absolute, and the power of the father is fundamentally a religious power. And the reason why the Senate won't intervene is because it's precisely the fathers who constitute the regime. And so there's a kind of implicit classical sense of subsidiarity here, that there's something inviolable about the power of the father to rule. Um, Even Fustel talks about how the father sits in the judgment seat in the court of his own home, and his judgments are supreme. So, a father is like a Supreme Court justice in his own home, and he can decide his own disputes. Now, so the state, the government can't decide any. I mean, we have civil disputes between families in our courts. There would be none of that for them. Now, a father could be judged, right, by the Senate, but his children couldn't be. His wife couldn't be. And I think that gives you the sense of the the way in which the civilization is structured is, Catholics have one way of saying that the family is the fundamental unit. The ancients have another way of saying that it is both the fundamental unit, and it has a it's already political, if I can put it that way. Some conservatives like this idea of the pre-political, that the family is pre-political to the civic order. That is not an ancient view at all. The ancients absolutely view the family as political. It's political all the way through. It's religious all the way through. And the Senate respects that, respects that the family is the basic political, social, religious unit of, and doesn't in a sense have rights over the father.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that even as many of these families kind of bind together in what he calls the gens here, kind of the old families, the patrician families, inside of them, they still have this order where there are judges and priests, and it's kind of sacred rights that only belong to that family, only belong to that gen. And so basically, even once we start seeing more of the formation of the state, there are still all these subdivides inside these families that have more weight, that have more authority than whatever the top government level of government would have. And so, like you said, that level of subsidiarity, where kind of each level has an authority that can't be breached by kind of the formal state, is a constant theme throughout here. And he really also breaks in to the fact that a lot of what he's talked about is from kind of the nobility, that you had, your patrician families, and then they had the clients that got to share the religion of those families, and then you had the plebs who had kind of no religion at all, or did not have a connection to this religion. And so in some ways, slaves who were brought into the worship of these households were considered kind of more citizens or part of the ancient city than the plebs were, because they were initiated into the worship in a way that these outside plebs without a religion were not. Oh, got a relocation and lost him again. Okay, well, he'll probably be back right away. But yeah, guys, so that was a big part of what he talks about. That Oh, and we're back again. Okay, hopefully that's a
Sorry,
better connection for you.
I hope this is better over here. Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, no, I was just talking about this patrician client distinction versus the plebs, and how the
Yes.
big delineation was the lack of religion on the part of the plebs. They were not considered part of kind of the original ancient city, mainly because they did not have this connection to the ancient religions. They didn't have the worship that the other families had.
I think that's one of the striking things here is the class distinctions that come out very strongly in his history. That the political religious nature of families is primarily a aristocratic thing. The plebs don't have this strong connection. They might indeed have religious practices, but they're not constitutive. They don't give them power. They might, they might engage in various religious exercises, but they're alienated from the central rights, the central rights of the civic religion. And I think he rightly, draws out the way in which the relationship between the paters and the plebs plays out in the various revolutions, both the Greek revolutions and especially the Roman revolutions. The He does a very, very good job of kind of tracing religion through the different revolutions from the monarchical period to the republican period to the imperial period in the Roman history, and helps you to see, in a sense, how the civil wars that develop between, the sort of few and the many. The war that develops between the few and the many is partly a religious war, partly a war between those who have access uh, to the hearth, the Vesta, and those who don't.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly interesting because, Joseph de Maistre talks about how that constitutions are really only a reflection of, again, the traditions, the folkways, the religious beliefs of the people. That you can't really, just create these things out of thin air. And the more you try to write them down, the more they lose their power, because the real binding power was that shared tradition, that shared origin, that shared religion. And so what's very interesting is, kind of as the plebs want to participate more in society, they start demanding law, because the law of the city did not apply to them. The law was only for the religious and those who shared the worship. And so as they demand kind of their own law, they almost kind of demand a secularization in some ways of the law. It still wouldn't be secular in the way we're talking about, we would think of today, but something that is not of the original worship. And due to the formalization of that law that otherwise would have been kind of perpetuated through the gens, perpetuated through the families, perpetuated through the tradition and religion, and instead placing it kind of outside that tradition, you kind of start to see the first crack in kind of the control, or the complete inclusion only based on the worship there.
That's right. You get a kind of pulling away, and Fustel has a very interesting explanation for this. He says explicitly that this happens because the religion has lost power. When religion loses power, when it loses its kind of explanatory hold on the gens, on the kind of aristocratic structures, it generated alongside of it um, laws, a law and a politics which were not so tightly bound, not so suffused, and so he kind of describes a kind of unraveling which begins to occur. But the reason why you get the unraveling, and you get this just prior to the advent of Christianity, you get this unraveling of religion and politics at just the point at which religion is losing its power. And as religion loses its power, then the plebs actually make a play for power and succeed in large part.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because he talks about the interplay throughout these different revolutions. You talked about, how he kind of details these different revolutions, and he describes each one, I think, as an interplay between both the religion losing hold and the desires of those who were outside the religion to be integrated into the city. So
Yeah.
he specifically says in the book, in order for the state to grow in power, the power of the families had to be lessened, right? Had to be dissolved. And so,
Completely.
yeah, and so I think there's an interplay here where the religion is weakening, but also it is in the material interests and the political interests of many to see that authority weakened. And again, this is kind of this is Bertrand de Juvenel's high and low versus middle, where
Right.
the king or those that wish to kind of remove the aristocracy, the established middle from their positions of power, can offer new enfranchisement or new attachment to the lower classes to garner power for themselves. And this is specifically done through religion because religion, like you said, was so essential to this. So instead of just offering people, the franchise or something, which did eventually happen, but very specifically, religion is offered to the plebs. And so in order for the plebs to have a role in the society, they have to acquire their own religion, and it has become part of the civic religion for them to kind of then enter into the ancient city. So, for instance, they have these, these citywide sacrifices where they share the meals that have been burnt to the city gods, and this is
Right.
what then allows kind of the larger integration of those who were not politically enfranchised into the whole.
Right. And you notice that at that point religion becomes public. You've moved from having religion which is private in the domestic sphere to having a kind of, you know, friendly dynamic between the domestic hearth and the civic hearth, to then the civic hearth dominating at the expense of the family institutions and the expense even of family religion. So I think that this expansion of power is kind of a zero sum game with the family institutions and the family religion, and the tensions of the civil wars are marked by this. I also think it's notable that the civic religions as they progress get more and more vicious. The civic religion gets more and more perverse. So the demos's religion is not necessarily elevated for being more greatly shared.
Yeah,
More
and yeah, in many ways, it's a bastardization. So, for instance, he talks about how the consulship or the kingship had to be stripped of its religious connotations once the plebs started entering into the equation, because the plebs wanted to be able to have a say for this, have a vote, have a voice. But if they were having a voice, that would have ruined the worship, and so they had to separate what had once been kind of the chief and the priest were the same, and they were integrated, and they had to be separated so that the wider populace could participate and the religion could be protected. But once the religion had been separated out of these leadership positions, people forgot that it should have been integrated in the first place. And so the religion, the weakness of the religion allowed for the separation, but the separation then created further weakening of the religion, because once people no longer understood these offices as religious in nature, and their authority as religious in nature, the religion then itself also starts to recede.
Yeah, no, there's a kind of of feedback loop of the loss of religious strength and political expansion of power. Yeah.
So I also wanted to touch on the fact that again repeatedly talks about how these different ways of religiosity, each one of these revolutions that brought that brought the plebs in, that brought more outside elements in, that reduced the authority of the family, also uh, you know fundamentally changed the way that the religion was practiced. And it's funny because a lot of people today, it's very popular, especially for a certain segment of kind of the online right, to say, well, Christianity undid all this stuff, right? Christianity is for the downfall of
Yeah.
the Roman Empire. It's what brought about all this bad stuff. It's the problem now. This is the nature of Christianity. But what I think he shows in this case study is actually this is just the nature of power and how it interacts with religion. And that for power to grow and centralize, it needs to subsume these different parts of religion. And so Christianity does show up at the end of this weakened religion, like you were saying, but it is not the cause of the weakening of this religion. The religion had already been weakened through these many different revolutions that came in many ways due to the interests of the state.
I think he demonstrates the natural tendency of power and religion to go together, but also the natural tendency of power to want to dominate religion and to control religion, um, and finally for the priests to be subject to the pontiff or to the king, is the essential movement of ancient civilization and the narrative that he tells. It's the the triumph, finally, the ruling of the temporal over the spiritual, if we want to put it in contemporary terms, the way in which uh, politics triumphs over the spiritual. It's interesting because I don't talk about this in my piece at Post Liberal Order, but I do find it interesting that he has about a 10-page conclusion from which I dissent. I really like Fustel's study. It's just so helpful for all the reasons that you say, and I think it's also illuminating for our own times and thinking about the relationship between you know our aristocracy and what our aristocracy is fighting for, and what our few are fighting for, and what our many are fighting for, have some similar dynamics. But one of the things that Fustel concludes, and I think it doesn't follow from his argument throughout, is that Christianity changed everything by separating religion and politics. That's his kind of final conclusion, without any evidence. He doesn't, it's as if Charlemagne never existed for Fustel somehow at the end, and I think there's reasons for that. I think it goes back to who he regards as his audience in the Third Republic in the 19th century, and he has a really complicated agenda. One is to just totally destroy the idea that you could have some religiously neutral regime. You could have some political order without religion, but uh, also to, in a sense, caution uh, his French philosophe friends about the idea of power overtaking religion, power commanding religion, power dictating religion. And so he has this almost, I think, liberal Catholic idea of protecting the Catholic Church, from the power of liberal politics by insisting on another kind of separation, which doesn't really map onto the 2,000 years he misses, or the 1900 years he misses. in terms of Christian history, because he just doesn't touch Christian history. But I think he has his eye on that question of, how should liberals regard the Catholic Church? Well, they should regard it as set apart, as separate from the liberal order and respected, and that you should be forewarned, because religion is powerful, and you should let it be its own, especially let Christianity be its own separate transcendent thing above your laws and above your attempt to command and control Christianity.
Yeah, I have to say this is something that continues to baffle me when people talk about history and Christianity. That there's just this always been this separation between Christianity and the law or governance, particularly when they pretend that like Christianity never allowed for for the protection of the state, through force and these kind of things. Like no one ever heard of Charles Martel. Nobody knows about Charlemagne. Like none of this stuff
Exactly.
ever happened. It is
Exactly.
fast. Yeah, it is fascinating that this is something I hear from both left and very far right, that the Christianity is this soft, squishy thing that never got involved in politics and was never able to protect itself or others. And I just don't know what history they're looking at, because it's just in no way reflected in the actual record. But I do want to talk about what you mentioned there, which I think for the next half of our kind of broadcast would be what lessons we can draw from this. What should modern people see from this now that we have a better understanding of kind of the relationship and the weaving of religion into all of these things? What are some lessons right off the top of your head that maybe people should understand in the modern day when we're looking at our politics and the way it might relate to religion?
Well, I mean, I think the one of the really big takeaways for me was to understand that in our contemporary terms, we have the few, we have our own kind of gens who are kind of trying to institute a very kind of pseudo religious account of their power, call it wokeness or whatever. And this kind of pseudo religious sentiment um, has rights that goes with it. It has sacraments that goes with it. The sacrament of abortion, the pride flag, the progress flag. These are all highly religious kinds of commitments that are being promoted by the few, the corporate few. C-suite boards, aristocratic power is engaging in essentially the use of religious power to establish their control over civilization. And we see, the party of the many kind of pushing back against that. The Bud Light's a kind of, great example of this, where you have, okay, they realized it didn't go well, and they said sorry about, Dylan Mulvaney. But ultimately, if they would have gotten away with that, they would have been perfectly happy with that campaign, because it was a classic example of the few using religion, a kind of religious sentiment, to try to create a new way of binding people together. And Bud Light, that's a pleb product, right? That's not a product for aristocrats, our own progressive aristocrats. That's a NASCAR beer. So if the few could go in and capture the religio, the religion of the plebs, and turn it to their own hearth, as it were, they would have gained enormous power. Enormous power. Same Miller Lite's very interesting, though different on the same question. Is you see a kind of a gens of the progressive aristocrat working out its religious power to gain political control of the plebs, and then you also see the plebs fighting back.
So I think there's a really interesting transition happening here. And I
Yeah,
think it's what's giving a lot of classical liberals whiplash.
yeah,
So Alistair MacIntyre talks in After Virtue about how managerialism is kind of the political theology of our day, and that like the extraction of expertise
Hmm.
and the ability to plan and create this miracle of progress is kind of what gave them their political formula. And it feels like wokeness is here because that's failing, because we can't they can no longer produce that efficiency. They can no longer justify the idea of objectivity and kind of material progress from what's happening. And so instead, we need a new kind of faith to enter in.
Yeah.
And the reason that a lot of classical liberals are lost is they never thought of managerialism as a faith. They never understood it as the kind of the religious substrate that kind of bound their world together. And so now they see this new, maybe perhaps more clearly religious to them sentiment being created by the same cast that was supposed to be completely bought into kind of the managerial liberalism, and they are lost. They are confused in that moment. Do you think that that tension will find a way to ease itself, or is that going to be a showdown that we're going to see here?
I mean, it's interesting because the first thing that popped in my head was precisely Fustel's phrase: is they lost power because their religion lost power.
Yeah.
And I think this is true for classical liberals as well. I think they're losing power because something about how they held the world together, and there was something religious about how they held the world together. That that kind of separation that they imagined, a kind of neat sort of, here's politics over here, here's religion over here. I think that neat separation, and which is kind of baked into liberalism, has lost its power. Nobody believes it anymore. I mean, the whole kind of everyone is now used to hearing, neutrality is a myth. You know, it's very hard to find people who will push back hard on, I think, one of the central theses of liberalism, which is that you can have this neutral public space that's not religious, that's indifferent to religion. Nobody thinks that anymore. And in a sense, that's the loss of its religious power. And I think that's why classical liberals, are back-footed on all of this, because, as you say, in a sense, they had assumptions that have crumbled.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right that I think a lot of people who talk about this a lot may not believe that anymore. But I think most people still do believe that.
Okay.
Like I think, and that's why I think so many of the classical liberal kind of opponents of wokeness play to wider audiences,
Right.
because most people are still bought into this idea, and it's falling apart. There are pieces of it falling apart. Ironically, the postmodern moment might be the best thing to kind of shake up the idea. Religious people very afraid of postmodernism, but it might be the thing that shakes a lot of people out of this idea that you can avoid this religious scenario, that there is a secular society. But I think we're in an interesting transition where that is becoming more apparent, but is still not, I think, understood by the vast majority of people. And so there's still this idea that we'll be able to create this liberal consensus once again. We'll be able to reconstitute it once everybody stops being crazy and gets over the wokeness and whatnot.
Yeah.
That we'll be able to kind of reform it again. And I wonder, do you? So
You
obviously
probably
we
just get enough critical race theory, anti-critical race theory legislation through, then people will come back to their senses, and the managers in the C-suite will stop producing Dylan Mulvaney or whatever beer.
right. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is like, look, don't get me wrong. I'm for the use of state power to stop this stuff.
Agreed. Yeah.
But the again, as Demistra asserted, as Fustel says, once you have to write this stuff down, it loses its power. Like, the
Exactly.
reason this stuff has power is that it was already understood and practiced and believed in by the people. And so you can't just legislate out this stuff. You have to understand the kind of the level at which it's at. So I guess that brings us to kind of the next point. If we, as people who are reading this book and understanding the centrality of religion
Yeah.
to kind of these processes of society, of the city, of law, all this stuff, if we know that we cannot have a neutral society. Many people who then hear me make this argument, or you make this argument, other people say this argument, immediately come back with, oh, well, then it's just got to be, it's got to be you're the only one who's right. You're the only one who's right. How do you, in a society steeped in in liberalism, and
Yeah.
that kind of using that still, even though they now find themselves ruled by wokeness, how do you work against the ruling ideology without by, kind of letting people know, like, yeah, no, something has to replace this. It's not just going to be neutral once this is gone.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way, I mean, if I were to have written the last 10 pages on Christianity for Fustel, one of the things I would have said is that uh, that Christianity didn't really change the notion that religion and politics go together. It didn't really change that. What it changed was the superiority of the true religion over a bad religion to hold a society together. And so I think the reason why Christianity kind of delivers us a civilization which draws up the Greek and the Roman, right? It doesn't it the Christianity doesn't, on some level, it's a massive break from the ancient world, but on another level it just delivers all this back to us under true religio, true religion. And I think the proper conclusion to Fustel's book, if you aren't a liberal Catholic, is that the natural conclusion is Christianity raises the whole question of divine revelation. Has God spoken? Do we have true religion? And if we do have true religion, it should produce a better kind of society. It should produce a more just society. And I think that's the kind of level of conversation that we need to have. What kind of society do we want to pass on to our children? What would it look like? What religion would be good at producing that? And then you have to face the question of, well, only a true religion could produce good results. And I think that's kind of the best answer I think you can give to the person who says, well, we can't know the true and the good. That's immediately falsifiable because you don't like the bad religion and what it's producing. Right? The reason why you don't like the fruits of the woke empire is because its religion's false. And so that you're going to have an unhappy society, and we have a massively unhappy society. And why do we have a massively unhappy? Why do we have these deaths of despair? We have these deaths of despair because we're operating on a totally false ersatz religion. And so I think that's the only way in which you can address the person who says which religion. At the very least, you have to have the conversation. Well, not this one, right? Because this one's making you very unhappy.
Sure. And for so many of these people, one of the, I think, the bad lessons that a lot of these kind of reformed liberals or post liberals or kind of atheists who saw the problem with kind of wokeness and what was going on is they just kind of took the lesson that, well, if wokeness is a religion, then it's just bad because it's a religion, and all religions are bad.
Yeah.
And so we should just kind of eliminate all of them. And this is something that I've argued against many times. I'm sure many people who are listening to this now are very familiar with this argument, but it's just that you can sit around and talk about like how you need to ally with people and you need to form coalitions, and I'm with you on this, but like at some point, if these people do not have an answer to this problem, then they kind of have to listen to the people who do, right? Like, you've got to find something to bind people together. And if you don't have anything and you understand the thing that's binding kind of the current regime together is bad, then maybe you should listen to the people who have something that does actually do this.
I think that's right. And the flip side to everyone who always raises a pluralism, but what about pluralism? I mean, the flip side to pluralism is, well, what about the kind of unity that would enable us to be truly plural? Like the flip side of plural is unity. And what gives us our unity, in which we could be actual. Well, nobody. I mean, pluralism today just means being progressive or something. I think pluralism doesn't mean that everybody's different. It kind of means everybody has to think the same way. Is what pluralism seems to me to mean. As soon as you're starting to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, I think I know exactly what you think.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you think, and you think exactly the same as somebody else who says diversity, inclusion, and equity. That if that's what pluralism means, I know it doesn't really mean pluralism. It just means uniformity of thought. And so you need to, I think, answer every kind of cry for pluralism with a cry for, yeah, but what gives us unity? What's the generative unitive thing that makes us a people? And I I think the classic ancient answer is religion. It's bad religion for the ancients from a Christian point of view, but I think Christianity's great innovation, great radical revolution is not in saying that religion isn't our unity, but that we can only be united by God Himself coming down into the person of Jesus Christ. That's true religion, and that's the source of unity, and also the source of any true pluralism.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the book, he talks about how basically a son is only a son because they are initiated into the worship. And even if you have a biological son, if he's not of the mother who entered the family through religious rites, or if the son leaves for another family, renounces the name of the family and its worship, then it doesn't matter. He doesn't have any rights anymore. And an adopted son who is entered through these kind of religious rites gains legitimacy in a way that the biological son doesn't have. And if they've kind of left the worship, and I think it's really difficult to find another way to bind
Yeah.
kind of a large community together, because the civic nationalism of so many of these classic liberals is kind of obviously useless in the long run, because it's like, okay, well, what binds the nation together? Oh, well, they all share the same idea. Okay, well, what happens if someone in America decides they don't share the idea anymore? Do they lose their citizenship? Well, no. Okay, well, then what does your civic nationalism mean? Like, of what value is it? Like, you need something that is deeper and eternal, more connected to identity and who you are, if you're going to actually have any kind of useful binding of a nation. Just, oh, we all happen to agree on something for 10 seconds and then everybody parts ways on it, is no way to actually have any kind of functional society.
Exactly, and it's not like he Fustel completely recognizes that the family is a natural thing, a man
Mhm.
and a woman coming together and creating new life, but it's what binds, the family together as a unity, as something which is generative. That's where the gens comes from, and for that he says you need religion, and if you don't have religion to bind together, you're going to reduce to blood. And blood is just not a sufficient supplier of unit. And I think when I hear that, I think, well, this is why we're obsessed with race, being white or black, or that all of these kind of nationalisms that work on blood, on a unity of blood, are not going to work. They're not going to work. They're just not going to hang together. And Fustel's kind of gives you 2,000 years of classical history to show you that the blood unity just doesn't work. You need religio to bind a family together, to bind a city together, to uh, bind philosophers together, everything, to bind uh, just about everything, business even.
Well, and I think it's interesting that, maybe even those who are not Christian, guys like Spangler or Evola,
Sure.
thought that reducing race to simply biological or blood ties was a mistake, that it was a tragedy of understanding. They understood race as a as kind of a cultural continuation, a binding metaphysical spirit, not simply a direct descent of genetic lineage.
Right.
Um,
Even they recognize that it has to be religious, whatever it is.
Right, and so I think that idea is, I think the modern conception is one that ignores many people, even those who wouldn't have been Christian, and their understanding of kind of what actually tied a civilization together and what made a race in their constitution, their definition of that,
What
which I
makes a
think is
nation, what makes a race, is always going to be something that is trans-temporal.
yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we hit most of what I wanted to talk about there. We have a few questions from the audience here that we might hit real quick. Before we do, is there anything that we didn't get to touch on that you wanted to cover?
Well, I mean, the only thing that is interesting is a phrase I use in the piece at Post Liberal Order is pseudo integralism. We hear a lot about integralism, and people have very strong views about integralism, and they think it's one thing. And I call wokeism a pseudo integralism because the question of integralism is, in a sense, the same question of what will integrate, what will unite, what will make a society whole. And the question of integralism is really just that question: is what's the religio that's going to give integrity to a society as a common thing, as a thing that everybody can share in. And what I think makes wokeness a pseudo integralism is it is actually trying to unite us all in a common view. Let's all share a view of abortion. Let's all share a view of gays. Let's all share the same view of trans, drag queen story hour. Let's all get on the progress train, because they have a vision of an integrated society in which everyone is sharing in the common faith, and it's precisely what the many are resisting, and I think they're resisting for both political and religious reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also, I think, important for people to remember that, you need to dissolve if you're going to manage a large amount of people, if you're going to create this kind of globalism that they'd like to have rule everybody, you need to dissolve moral and cultural particularism. You have to collapse again those competing spheres of social authority and moral authority. And so it's really important to dissolve, all these different ideas and make sure they're unified under kind of this one cosmopolitan and hedonistic understanding of kind of human well-being and good. And so it's really important to understand that the wokeness is in many ways has a political utility to these people, but they also believe it very deeply. It's not just one or the other. It's both. It is a binding religion, and also something that has a high degree of political utility.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why it has power too is that in some ways it's a parody of Christianity. It's still tied in. I mean, whatever you want to call it, cathedral, or the way in which Puritanism expresses itself through Boston and through elites, and through the few, communicating in a kind of cell division of ideas that descend from a kind of moral purity and a puritanicalism. I mean, we see that very, very strongly, and the the way in which wokeness is parasitic on Christianity is also what explains a lot of its religious power.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is definitely a Christian heresy, and would have to be because Christianity is what had bound the West together before it. And since it has, I don't think, any particularly generative qualities of its own, all it can really do is bind together the kind of the fumes, the remaining Christian ethos. But once it's kind of deracinated
Yeah,
Christianity, then it's eventually going to die. And that's the upside and I think that's what
yeah,
we're seeing for a lot of people is the power of that religion is very very shallow because it calls on forces it doesn't really control and separates them from things that are actually meaningful, and so it can only really push push those things so far, especially because it's denying truth about not just the metaphysical but the directly biological at this point. So
Yeah, and I think we've seen it in history before with Arianism. I mean, Athanasius woke up one day and said the whole world has become, Arian, and Arianism wasn't defeated by holding hands and singing Kumbaya.
right.
And same with Albigensianism. It ran through Europe like wildfire, and I think we have to come to terms with how important it is to fight heresy. This is something that the liberal conscience does not like. This idea that you would fight heresy, but there really is religious heresy, and it's important to know what religious truth is in order to know how to defeat it.
I mean, they do love fighting heresy. Just their current version of it is,
No,
they're
that's what
all
I
on
mean.
board
Is
with it.
like
It
you
sounds,
need
yeah.
to know what they believe that they have true religion, but if you press them, they can't really support it.
Right. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and jump over to, I think, a question or two we have real quick. Before we do, is there anything you want people to check out, the post-liberal order, or anything else that you want people to read or follow you or anything?
Yeah, of course. Come find us. My friend Patrick Denis and Gladden Papin and I have this post liberal order that we're having a lot of fun with, and yeah, and if you know anybody who would like to submit to us, shoot us an email. I'm just Pecknold at cua.edu, and you can find post liberal order at Substack. So.
All right, let's go ahead and jump over super chat real quick. Colin for $5. It makes some very large assumptions around origins and customs that ring true to me. Are there modern refutations or criticisms of this work? So yeah, I know that a lot of this, like you said, a lot of this existed before archaeology, and it's thoroughly footnoted, but it is all based on a lot of Livy and such. And I understand that he is filling in a lot of the logical holes here, kind of with his own understanding. I think he does a pretty good job with that, but it is, of course, not a document of complete exact historical accuracy. I guess I'm sure there are people who have some problems with kind of the conclusions he draws.
I think that's right. I think there's he gets it largely right. I think the consensus in the amongst classicists, and now you probably get a classicist calling in, but my sense is that, well, one is that religion and antiquity is not the biggest field in classics, and it doesn't get as much treatment as it should. Um, there have been studies. Mary Beard comes to mind. I.B. Collins, I think. But the classical studies, I think, generally remark on how right he gets things, considering that he has no archaeological evidence before him. All he has are the old texts, and he's kind of piecing things together from firsthand accounts of their world, and he gets it right like 80% of the time, and that's remarkable in itself. Does he get things wrong from time to time? Yes. But on the main, I think it remains the best book on ancient religion, from the primary text.
Yeah, and guys, just as a thought on kind of how you view many of these texts when you're trying to understand a lot of this stuff, there's a very modern impulse to say, well, if there's something wrong here, then it's all useless, right? If
Right.
there's yeah, if there's a bad interpretation somewhere, if the footnoting was wrong, if we discover something else, it was written in 1860, so
Right.
we might have figured something else out between here and 1860. People will say, "Oh, well, that's wrong." So just the whole argument falls apart. None of it's worthwhile. And I think
I
it's really
completely
important,
disagree with his last 10 pages, but I think
right?
I think it's the most important book on Roman religion.
Sure. There are many philosophers, many theorists that I think get certain things wrong, that make certain shortcomings, but are still extremely valuable. And I just really encourage people not to throw the baby out with the bathwater with so much of this stuff. That everyone's looking for, oh, well, this one guy had a crackpot idea, or he got one part of an analysis wrong. and so therefore it's just not useful. No, find the useful parts. Find the things that are mostly right. Find the things that hang together, connect them to other things that are useful, rather than just trying to find one particular flaw and then suddenly discarding something that otherwise has a lot of explanatory power or is very useful in many ways,
Right.
just because again you find one thing that it turned out not to be correct.
There's a new translation which I haven't looked at by Jody Bottom's daughter. I can't remember her first name at the moment, but if you look up, there's a new translation which I'm interested in looking at for myself. But the thing I was going to say about it is that it's just beautifully written, and you learn a lot about the ancients. You know, whether or not you agree with everything, you just get a treasure trove of texts. You know, both Greek and Latin.
Yeah, I've got this edition, which I actually wouldn't recommend. It's poorly formatted.
Okay, yeah.
But I've heard Imperium Press has a good one. I'm sure there are others that are out there. But yeah, it is well written. It is, I think, very cogently put together. Again, it's heavily footnoted, so if you want to go back and look through primary sources, you can do so. So I do think even again, if everything isn't perfect, if you don't agree with every part of it, it's still well worth your time. I think it does open up your mind to a way of being that is very hard for modern people kind of wrap their mind around. And it might even have you thinking more about, okay, what is the religion of my city? What is, what rituals are we performing together? What things are we centering, and what are we using to kind of bind our culture together? And are those things actually revealing the good and the beautiful and the true? Are they really connecting us to things of value? Is it really going to last in the long run? So
I think that's the really crucial thing, is he makes you attentive to what's going to be durable.
absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. But once again, I want to thank Chad Pecknold for coming on. I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. Had some good chat going on there. Really appreciate it as always. Of course, if this is your first time coming by, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. And if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on all your favorite podcast platforms. If you do that, please go ahead and leave a rating or a review. That'll really help out with everything. Guys, I also was on Timcast last week. That's why all of my normal streams that were usually live weren't live, because I was traveling during that. But we will be live again tomorrow. I'm actually going to be finishing up my series with Michael Millerman on the fourth political theory and Alexander Dugin. So if you want to go ahead and check that out, you can tune in tomorrow at 2:30. Thanks for coming by, guys. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.